Everyone talks about the Wall of Sound. Everyone knows about the New Orleans bust. But there's this other story, one that doesn't show up in the documentaries, one that most people outside the serious tape trading community have never heard. And it might be the most Grateful Dead thing that ever happened. The Dead just finished 2 sets. We're talking Primal Dead here. Dark Star into St. Stephen into the 11, the whole thing. The kind of show where you knew something special was happening while it was happening. But after the last note faded and the audience filtered out into the San Francisco night, there was a problem. A dispute over payment. The promoter and the band couldn't agree on the money, and the promoter's solution was to lock up their equipment. All of it. The PA system, the amps, everything the Dead needed to keep touring. According to accounts in Steve Parish's memoir Home Before Daylight and other crew oral histories, what happened next became legend among the road crew. Larry Ramrod Shurtliff and Owsley Bear Stanley broke into the venue sometime after that show and took the equipment back, just loaded up the gear and drove away. The band's equipment, the band's crew, gone before anyone could stop them. Now, here's where you need to understand something about the Grateful Dead in 1969. This wasn't a band that showed up at venues and used whatever sound system the promoter provided. By this point, they'd already started pioneering something that seems obvious now, but was revolutionary then. They traveled with their own gear. Owsley had been building custom sound systems, financing equipment, basically inventing what modern touring would become. The Dead had rejected the idea of relying on promoters' inadequate PA systems. They hauled everything themselves in an unmarked step van, and that equipment wasn't just gear. It was their sound, their identity, the entire reason they could be the Grateful Dead, instead of just another band struggling with bad venue acoustics. So, when that equipment got locked up over a payment dispute, it wasn't just some amps being held hostage. It was threatening the band's ability to exist as a touring entity. And the crew, Ramrod, Bear, Steve Parish, the guys who spent 16 to 20-hour days hauling and setting up and breaking down this gear, they weren't about to let that happen. To understand why this mattered, you need to know who Ramrod was. And I don't mean the sanitized version, I mean the actual person. He'd been with the band from the prankster days, worked his way up to equipment manager, and he had this philosophy about his role that most people wouldn't understand. In March of 1983, Mickey Hart and Ramrod did this interview with David Gans for the Grateful Dead Hour, and Hart said something that stops you cold if you really listen to it. He said, "I play for Ramrod first." Not the audience, not Jerry, Ramrod. Because, as Hart explained, he takes my drums and hauls them all over the country, sets them up, takes them down, and returns them to me as good as he took them out. That's the relationship we're talking about. That's why the crew would risk breaking and entering. Because to them, protecting that equipment wasn't just a job, it was keeping the music alive. Ramrod himself said in that same interview, "I like it. I get off when everything's working right. The music melting together, fitting together, the musicians playing and not arguing." And then he said something even stranger. "I know that I can make the music bad if I want to, just by thinking." Think about that. The equipment manager believed his consciousness could affect the sound. And Hart agreed with him. Hart said everybody in the Grateful Dead was self-motivated, that nobody was anybody's boss. The situation was the boss. The situation was that their gear was locked up and they had more shows to play. But here's what makes this story even better. The Fillmore incident wasn't the only time the Dead's equipment got seized, and the other times show you exactly what was at stake. February 1st, 1970, New Orleans. The band plays a show, everything's fine, and then federal agents show up. They confiscate Owsley Stanley, the sound man himself, and they confiscate the entire PA system. The whole thing. So the Dead arrive at their next show the following night, the Fox Theater in St. Louis, and there's no PA. Nothing. They had to borrow a local sound system, and if you listen to the tape from that St. Louis show, you can hear the difference. The sonic character is completely different from what the Dead normally sounded like, because the Dead's sound wasn't just about the musicians. It was about Owsley's custom-built equipment, Ramrod's obsessive setup process, the entire ecosystem the crew had created. Jerry Garcia was reportedly furious after that St. Louis show. And you'd be furious too if you'd spent years building a sound system that could actually reproduce what you were trying to do musically, only to have it ripped away and replaced with whatever generic PA happened to be available. That's the context for understanding why the crew would break into the Fillmore. They'd seen what happened when they lost control of the equipment. They'd lived through the nightmare scenario, and they decided it wasn't going to happen again. There's this other story from May 10th, 1970 that shows how the Dead dealt with gear crises. Atlanta Sports Arena. According to promoter Murray Silver's account, the band showed up and their equipment wasn't there. Silver called Duane Allman, who lent them his PA system, and then the Allman Brothers sat in for this legendary Turn On Your Lovelight jam that people are still talking about decades later. And yeah, that show was magical, but it was magical because of the improvisation it forced, not because anyone wanted to be borrowing equipment. The Dead wanted their own system. They'd earned it, they'd built it, the crew knew what they had to do to protect it. Steve Parish, Jerry Garcia's guitar tech, talked about this mentality years later in interviews. Even after he became the Jerry Garcia Band's manager, he said, "I could not let go of the equipment. I still came in and restrung the guitars and plugged Jerry in and kept that bond with him." That's not normal. That's a guy who understood that the equipment was the connection, the physical manifestation of the music. And when you're that invested, when you've spent all night setting up amps and testing microphones and making sure everything's perfect, you're not just going to stand by while someone holds it hostage over a payment dispute. The evolution of the Dead sound system tells the whole story, from the cobbled-together gear of the late 60s to the wall of sound that debuted at the Cow Palace on March 23, 1974. If you listen to the recordings from that show compared to the Fillmore West in '69, the evolution is staggering. But they would never have gotten there if the crew hadn't been willing to do whatever it took to protect their equipment when it mattered. And here's the thing that really gets me. The band trusted the crew completely. Mickey Hart said in that '83 interview that he never had to tell Ramrod what to do. He's self-motivated, Hart said. The musicians could focus on playing because they knew Ramrod and Bear and Parish and Rex Jackson were handling everything else. That trust meant when the crew decided to reclaim the equipment, the band didn't question it. The crew had proven themselves over and over. They worked those 16 to 20-hour days that reviewers of Parish's memoir talk about, wielded what one writer called exceptional power and influence. And they did it all for the music. There's this moment in the Grateful Dead Hour interview where Ramrod quotes Robert Hunter, the lyricist, the poet, and Hunter had said, "Ramrod never says anything, but every time he does, he's wrong." It's a joke, obviously, one of those inside things that show how much they all loved each other, but the truth behind the joke is that Ramrod didn't need to say much. He just did what needed to be done. And when what needed to be done was breaking into a venue and loading up the band's equipment, according to the stories that survive in crew memoirs, he did that too. The story doesn't have some dramatic legal consequence or showdown. The crew took the gear, the band kept touring, and life went on. Which is somehow the most Grateful Dead ending possible. Because it was never about revenge or making a point, it was about keeping the music going. Ramrod said the musicians play differently when they know the crew is focused, that if the crew isn't present in the right way, it can interrupt everything. The music melting together, fitting together, that's what mattered. Not promoter politics, not contracts, not who technically owned what. The music. Look, the Grateful Dead's history is full of these moments that don't make it into the official documentaries. Borrowing Duane Allman's PA in Atlanta, scrambling to play St. Louis with a borrowed sound system the night after the New Orleans bust. These aren't the stories casual fans know, but they're the stories that explain how the band actually functioned. They're the stories that show why the Dead could tour for 30 years, why they became the template for every jam band that followed, why their community was so strong. Because at the center of it all was this simple idea that Mickey Hart articulated perfectly. We work for a living. We're a working band. And when you're a working band, you need your equipment. You need your crew. You need people who will, if the crew stories are to be believed, literally break into a venue to make sure the next show can happen. The Grateful Dead had that. They had Ramrod and Bear and Parish, guys who understood that their job wasn't just hauling gear, it was protecting the music itself. So, yeah, everyone talks about the Wall of Sound, everyone knows about Owsley's acid. But the night the crew reportedly took back the band's equipment, that's the story that shows you who the Grateful Dead really were. Not just the 6 guys on stage, but the whole family, the crew who made it possible, who kept everything working, who would do whatever it took to keep the music playing. In '69, what it took was a midnight mission that's documented in memoirs but doesn't get talked about enough. That's the real story of how the Grateful Dead stayed the Grateful Dead.